Have you ever been genuinely angry at someone simply because they were too good? I don't mean the polite, performative kind of good. I mean the kind of goodness that is reckless. The kind that actively harms the person holding onto it, leaving them bruised and empty-handed in a world that is already too eager to take. Tonight, as you listen to the heavy rain washing over the city, I want you to close your eyes. Relax your shoulders. Let the cold wind stay outside your window. I am going to tell you a story about my best friend, Sam. A boy who suffered from a very strange, very quiet curse. The curse of empathy. My earliest memory of Sam's absolute, infuriating stupidity was on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the monsoon season. We were 12 years old, living in a cramped, noisy neighborhood in Vietnam, where the alleys were so narrow the motorbikes would brush against your knees as they passed. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the rain was coming down in sheets, thick, blinding, and freezing. We were huddled under the rusted corrugated tin roof of a closed grocery store, our cheap sneakers soaked through, shivering in the humid chill. Sam had his hand buried deep in his thin jacket pocket, tightly clutching a small, sweaty wad of crumpled bills. It was his entire allowance. He had intentionally skipped buying lunch at school all week, enduring a growling stomach day after day, just to save up those few thousand dong notes for himself. Across the flooded street, the water was pooling around a broken street lamp. And sitting directly beneath it, huddled under a piece of torn, transparent plastic tarp, was a beggar. He was incredibly thin, his clothes plastered to his skin, coughing violently as the rain lashed at his back. His right leg was bound in dirty bandages and a makeshift wooden splint, but it looked suspiciously loose, like a theatrical prop rather than a real injury. I didn't pay him much mind. When you grow up on those streets, you learn to look away. You have to, but Sam didn't. I noticed Sam staring. "Don't," I warned him, my voice barely audible over the deafening rain. He didn't look at me. Without a word, Sam unzipped his jacket, pulled his entire week's savings from his pocket, stepped out from under the safety of our tin roof, and walked straight into the downpour. I watched in disbelief as the freezing rain instantly flattened his hair. He waded across the flooded street, dodging a passing motorbike that sprayed dirty water against his legs. He stopped in front of the shivering man. Sam didn't say anything. He just crouched down, gently pressed his crumpled bills into the man's grime-covered palm, and quickly stood up. Then, he turned around and walked back to me, his teeth chattering, completely soaked to the bone. When he stepped back under the awning, I lost my temper. I was furious. It was that hot, helpless anger you feel when you watch someone you care about set themselves on fire to keep a stranger warm. "Are you out of your mind?" I yelled, pushing his wet shoulder. "What is wrong with you, Sam? You've been starving all week. You complained about your stomach hurting all through math class just to save that cash. You know that leg is probably fine. Half of them are scammers, playing a part. He's a complete fake. He's just going to take your money and buy cigarettes or cheap liquor." Sam finally looked up at me. He was just a 12-year-old kid, shivering in the cold, but his eyes were so incredibly calm. Too calm. It was a look that made my own anger feel small and petty. "If that leg is a lie," Sam said, his voice steady despite his chattering teeth, "or if he uses that money for something bad, then that is his karma. That's on him." He paused, looking back across the street at the man, who was now pocketing the bills with a cunning, watchful gaze. "But," Sam continued softly, "if he is actually freezing and starving, and I stand over here, with money in my pocket, and I just walk away, then that guilt is on me. It becomes my fault. I just stared at him, speechless, the anger suddenly stuck in my throat. Sam leaned against the cold metal shutter of the store and closed his eyes. "I didn't buy him a meal, Leo," he whispered, wrapping his wet arms around himself. "I just bought my own peace of mind." Growing up didn't break Sam of his habit. If anything, the older we got, the more the city tried to punish him for it. The city we lived in was beautiful, but it could be deeply unforgiving if you were poor. And we were always poor. By our mid-20s, the romanticized struggle of youth had faded into the grinding, exhausting reality of adulthood. It was a gray, suffocating afternoon in late November. The kind of day where the smog hangs low, making the air taste like metal and exhaust fumes. We were walking back to our cramped apartment in silence. Sam had just been fired. He had spent the last 3 months working 12-hour shifts at a distribution warehouse, lifting crates until his hands blistered. But the manager, a ruthless man who preyed on desperate workers, had found a loophole to let him go without paying him his final month's wages. There was no HR department to complain to, no legal recourse, just the door. I remember walking beside him, feeling a toxic, helpless rage burning in my chest. I wanted to break something. Sam just looked hollowed out. In his right pocket was a single, wrinkled 200,000 dong note. Roughly $8. To most people in the world, that is pocket change. A cup of coffee and a pastry. But for us, in that neighborhood, at that exact moment, that crumpled piece of paper was his lifeline. It was a week's worth of instant noodles and plain rice. It was the only barrier between him and absolute starvation. We were waiting at a crowded, chaotic intersection. The traffic was a tangled mess of blaring horns and exhaust smoke. An old woman was trying to cross. Her back was bent almost at a 90-degree angle, and she was pushing a rusted metal cart overflowing with flattened cardboard boxes and crushed plastic bottles, scraps she had spent all day digging out of the trash to sell for a few coins. Just as she stepped off the curb, a reckless delivery driver on a motorbike tried to cut the corner. He clipped the side of her cart. He didn't even slow down. He just sped off into the smog. The cart tipped heavily to the side, hitting the wet asphalt with a loud crash. Weeks of the old woman's exhausting labor, dozens of plastic bottles and soaked cardboard, spilled out, scattering across the muddy street and rolling into the dirty gutters. The light turned green. Motorbikes swerved around her, honking impatiently. Pedestrians stepped over the scattered bottles, annoyed by the inconvenience. No one stopped. The city just kept moving, blind and deaf to the quiet tragedies happening on its sidewalks. I wanted to keep moving, too. I was so tired. I was so incredibly angry at the world for what had just happened to Sam. I didn't have any sympathy left to give. I nudged Sam to keep walking, but he had already stopped. I let out a heavy sigh, closing my eyes. "Sam, please, not today. We don't have the energy for this. Let someone else help." He didn't listen. He stepped off the curb, right into the chaotic traffic, ignoring the angry honks, and knelt down in the dirty water. I stood on the sidewalk, my jaw clenched so tight it ached, watching him. He patiently gathered the muddy bottles, wiping the grime off them, and restacked the heavy, wet cardboard onto her cart. The old woman was trembling, her frail hands frantically trying to save her livelihood, whispering apologies to the cars that beeped at her. Then, I saw Sam's hand move to his right pocket. My stomach dropped. My heart started pounding with a sudden, sharp panic. "No," I thought. "No, Sam, you idiot. You wouldn't." I took a step forward to stop him, but I was too late. He pulled out that single, wrinkled 200,000 dong note. His entire week's survival. He reached out and gently caught the old woman's trembling hand. He pressed the money into her palm and folded her thin fingers over it. "Oi," he said softly, calling her auntie in the local way. "You dropped this when the cart fell." She looked at the money, then up at him, her cloudy eyes wide with confusion. She knew she hadn't dropped it. She didn't have that kind of money to drop. But before she could refuse, Sam offered her a warm, reassuring smile, turned his back, and walked away. He stepped back onto the sidewalk next to me, his hands empty, his jeans stained with street mud. I just stared at him. The ambient noise of the intersection faded into a ringing in my ears. I looked at his empty pocket, then at his exhausted face. He had absolutely nothing left. He had just given away his own survival to a stranger on the worst day of his life. I didn't yell right away. The frustration was so deep, it was almost suffocating. You see, it's one thing to be generous when your cup is full. But watching someone pour from an empty cup, watching them break themselves apart to build someone else up, it doesn't make you feel inspired. It makes you feel desperate. That intersection wasn't an isolated incident. It was just a symptom of a chronic condition. If it had only been about the money, maybe I could have rationalized it. But Sam didn't just give away his last dollar. He gave away his comfort, his health, his very boundaries. He bled himself dry in 1,000 invisible ways. As you lie there, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, imagine the heavy, suffocating heat of a crowded night bus. We were traveling to a neighboring province for a temporary gig, trying to make up for the wages he had just lost. It was a grueling 8-hour ride on a vehicle that smelled of damp upholstery and stale diesel. After standing in line for hours, we had managed to secure 2 seats near the back. Sam was exhausted. The warehouse job had left dark, purple bags under his eyes and a constant, dull ache in his lower back. As the bus engine rumbled to life, a deep, vibrating hum that vibrated in our teeth, he leaned his head against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes. I could see the tension finally leaving his shoulders. 10 minutes before departure, an older woman boarded. She was carrying a sleeping toddler in one arm and dragging a heavy woven sack with the other. The bus was completely full. The driver told her she would have to sit on the floor in the narrow aisle. I saw Sam's eyes open in the reflection of the window. I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered, the exhaustion making my voice sharp. "Sam, your back is killing you. You need to sleep. She'll be fine. People do it all the time." He looked at me, that same infuriating, quiet apology in his eyes. He gently pulled his arm from my grip. He stood up, offered the woman his seat, and for the next 8 hours, I watched him fold his tall, bruised frame onto the dirty, vibrating metal floor of the aisle. Every time the bus hit a pothole, I saw him wince in the dim amber light. He didn't sleep a wink. He just stared at his hands while the woman and her child slept soundly in his seat. I sat there in the dark, the rhythmic thumping of the tires drumming against my skull, feeling a bitter mixture of guilt and rage. It is a terrible thing to resent someone for their kindness, but I did. I resented him for making me feel selfish, and I resented him for not knowing how to protect himself. And it was always like this. If we were walking home late at night and it started to pour, and we only had one small umbrella, I would always arrive home perfectly dry, only to turn and find Sam completely soaked because he had quietly tilted the umbrella entirely over me the whole way. If we passed a street vendor sitting on a dark corner at midnight, trying to sell the last of her cold, bruised fruit, Sam would buy it. He wouldn't even bargain. He would hand over whatever meager change we had left, knowing full well the fruit was rotting, just so the vendor could finally pack up and go home to her family. We would sit on the floor of our apartment later, peeling blackened bananas, trying to figure out how we were going to pay the electricity bill. It made me want to grab him by the collar. I wanted to shake him until he woke up to reality. I wanted to force him to look at his empty bank account, his worn-out shoes, his exhausted reflection in the mirror, and scream, "Look at what this is doing to you." You can only watch someone give away pieces of themselves for so long before there is nothing left. The world is a machine designed to take, and Sam was offering himself up to the gears. The tension between us was building like the static in the air just before a massive thunderstorm. It was heavy, it was suffocating, and eventually it had to break. The tension finally snapped on the walk home from that intersection. After I watched Sam press his last 200,000 dong into the old woman's trembling hand, I didn't say a word. I just grabbed him by the sleeve of his damp jacket and dragged him away. I pulled him fast and hard down the sidewalk, away from the traffic, away from the people, until we reached a narrow, dimly lit alleyway near our apartment building. The rain had started to fall again, a slow, heavy drizzle that soaked into the concrete and made the neon signs bleed their colors into the puddles. I shoved him back, not hard enough to hurt him, but hard enough to make his shoulders hit the damp brick wall. "Are you out of your damn mind?" I yelled. My voice echoed off the narrow walls, harsh and grating against the quiet rhythm of the rain. Sam didn't look up. He just leaned against the brick, water dripping from his chin, his breathing shallow and tired. "How long are you going to do this, Sam?" I demanded, stepping closer, pointing a finger at his chest. "How long are you going to play the saint? Play the martyr? You gave her everything. What are you going to eat tonight? Water? How are we paying the rent this month? Do you think the landlord cares about your good deeds when he kicks us out onto the street?" I was breathing heavily, my fists clenched at my sides. All the resentment from the bus ride, the rotting fruit, the endless, quiet sacrifices, it all boiled over. "Don't you have any pity for yourself?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Look at you. You're sick, you're exhausted, you're starving. Why do you care more about every stranger on the street than you care about your own life?" I waited for him to argue. I wanted him to fight back. I wanted him to throw his self-righteousness in my face so I could finally tell him how naive he was. But he didn't. Sam just stood there in the shadows. He slowly raised his hands, those bruised, calloused hands that had worked so hard for money he no longer had, and stared at his empty palms. The rain fell softly on them, washing away the street grime. Then, he smiled. It wasn't a peaceful smile. It was the most heartbreaking, exhausted smile I have ever seen on a human face. It was the smile of a man who was drowning and had simply stopped fighting the current. His broad shoulders slumped forward, all the energy leaving his body. "I know," he whispered. His voice was so incredibly fragile. I had to step closer just to hear him over the drizzle. "I know, Leo," he said, letting his hands fall heavily to his sides. It's a curse." He leaned his head back against the wet bricks, looking up at the narrow strip of gray sky between the rooftops. "You think I want to be like this?" he asked, his voice thick with a sorrow I hadn't realized he was carrying. "I see people walk past the homeless, past the injured, past the starving. They just look at their phones. They step over them. They go home, they eat a warm dinner, and they sleep perfectly fine." A single tear mixed with the rainwater rolling down his cheek. "I wish I could do that," Sam whispered, his voice breaking. "God, I wish I could just be indifferent. I wish I could just walk away and not feel it burning a hole in my chest. But I can't. I've tried. But once I see someone's pain, I can't pretend I'm blind. If I walk away, their pain just becomes my pain. And I can't sleep. I can't do it. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for me to understand the unbearable weight of his empathy. He wasn't acting like a savior. He was a prisoner to his own heart. The anger drained out of me so fast it left me dizzy. The fire in my chest was suddenly replaced by a cold, hollow ache. I stood there in the dark alley, the rain soaking through my clothes, looking at my best friend. I finally understood. He wasn't giving away his money because he thought he was better than everyone else. He was doing it because the alternative, the guilt of doing nothing, was a physical agony he couldn't survive. I didn't yell anymore. I didn't scold him. I just reached out, grabbed his cold, wet shoulder, and pulled him away from the wall. "Come on," I muttered, my voice thick. "Let's go home." The walk up the 5 flights of concrete stairs to our apartment was the quietest we had ever been. There was no more anger. Just the heavy, rhythmic sound of our soaked sneakers squeaking against the steps, and the distant, muffled drumming of the rain on the building's tin roof. With every flight of stairs, I watched Sam's posture deteriorate. The adrenaline from our argument in the alleyway was fading, leaving behind the stark, brutal reality of his physical condition. He was leaning his entire weight against the rusted iron railing, pulling himself up one step at a time. His breathing was shallow, his chest rattling slightly with a wet cough he had been trying to suppress all week. When I unlocked our door, the apartment was pitch black. The air inside felt thicker and colder than the air out on the street, carrying the familiar, depressing scent of damp plaster and old dust. I reached out and flicked the light switch. A single, pale fluorescent bulb flickered on, casting long, tired shadows across the bare walls. Sam didn't walk into the room. He practically fell into it. He stumbled toward his thin mattress on the floor and collapsed on the edge of it. He didn't even try to take off his wet jacket. He just sat there, staring blankly at the cracked linoleum floor, his hands trembling violently in his lap. The human body is a resilient machine, but it keeps a strict ledger. You can only borrow against your own health for so long before the debt comes due. And tonight, after weeks of 12-hour shifts, skipping meals, and standing in freezing rain to protect strangers, Sam's account was completely overdrawn. I walked over to him. "Sam, you need to get out of those wet clothes." He nodded slowly, but his fingers couldn't seem to grip the zipper of his jacket. They were too numb, shaking too hard. With a heavy sigh, I knelt down in front of him. I unzipped his jacket and pulled it off his shoulders. I untied his ruined, muddy shoes and pulled them off his freezing feet. As my hand brushed against his wrist, I felt a sudden, alarming heat. I pressed the back of my hand against his forehead. He was burning up. The fever must have been building all afternoon, masked by the cold rain. His skin was radiating a dry, dangerous heat, yet he was shivering so hard his teeth clicked together. He lay back on the mattress, curling into a tight ball, pulling the thin, worn blanket up to his chin. His eyes fluttered shut, his breathing coming in short, raspy gasps. "I'm sorry, Leo," he mumbled into the pillow, his voice completely broken. "I'm just so tired." "I know," I said softly, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Just sleep." I stood up and walked over to our tiny kitchenette. I opened the small, humming refrigerator. It was entirely empty, save for a half-empty bottle of tap water and a jar of cheap chili paste. I opened the cupboards. Nothing but a few grains of spilled rice in the corner. He had given away the last 200,000 dong. We literally had nothing to eat. Not tonight, and not tomorrow. I poured the tap water into a chipped glass and brought it back to the mattress, setting it on the floor beside him. But he was already asleep. Or rather, he had passed out. His face was pale, glistening with a feverish sweat, his brow furrowed even in his unconscious state. I sat back against the wall, listening to the heavy rain lashing against the thin window pane, and the labored, rattling sound of my best friend fighting a fever. The anger I had felt in the alleyway was entirely gone. It had evaporated, leaving behind a crushing weight of responsibility. I looked at Sam, lying there helpless, shivering in the dark. His curse had finally caught up to him. His empathy had emptied his pockets, ruined his health, and left him starving on a cold floor. He couldn't save himself. He never would be able to. Which meant, in this dark, cold apartment, with empty pockets and a storm raging outside, there was only one person left who could. Me. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the agonizing, wet rattle of Sam's breathing. I was always the pragmatic one, the survivor. I prided myself on being tough enough to navigate the jagged edges of the city. I knew how to look away. I knew how to hold on to what was mine. But sitting there, watching the person I cared about most shivering on a bare floor, I realized that survival is an incredibly ugly thing when you are doing it completely alone. I stood up. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I walked over to the small, battered closet in the corner of the room. From the back, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep out the dampness, I pulled out a heavy, vintage leather jacket. I had saved up for almost 2 years to buy it from a second-hand shop. It was my armor, the one nice thing I owned that made me feel like I was more than just another struggling kid in a forgotten neighborhood. I ran my hand over the cold leather one last time. Then, I grabbed my cheap, flimsy windbreaker, put it on, and walked right back out into the freezing monsoon. When I finally pushed the apartment door open again, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I was soaked to the bone. The wind had practically bitten through my thin jacket, leaving my arms numb and my teeth chattering. But my hands were full. The cold, stagnant air of the apartment was immediately pierced by the rich, warm scent of hot chicken broth, ginger, and toasted scallions. I had a large plastic container of hot rice porridge from a late-night street vendor, a small blister pack of fever-reducing medicine, and a few small bills left over. The leather jacket was gone, left behind the glass counter of a 24-hour pawn shop 3 blocks away. I knelt down on the floor next to Sam's mattress. He was still curled in a tight ball, trembling, trapped in the grip of the fever. I gently placed a hand on his burning shoulder. "Sam," I whispered, keeping my voice low and soft in the quiet room. "Hey, idiot, wake up. You need to eat," he groaned, his eyelids fluttering. It took him a moment to focus on me in the dim light. When the smell of the ginger and hot broth reached him, his eyes widened slightly. I helped him sit up, propping a thin pillow behind his back against the wall. His hands were shaking too much to hold the spoon, so I didn't offer it. I just scooped up the warm porridge, blew on it softly, and brought it to his mouth. We didn't say anything. The only sounds in the room were the relentless rain outside and the quiet clinking of the spoon. I fed him slowly, watching the warmth slowly return to his pale, drawn face. With every bite, a little bit of the tension seemed to melt out of his shoulders. When the bowl was empty, one popped 2 fever pills from the blister pack and handed them to him with a glass of water. He swallowed them, leaning his head back heavily against the wall, closing his eyes with a deep sigh of relief. Then, he looked at me. His gaze drifted from my wet hair down to the cheap windbreaker sticking to my freezing arms. He knew I didn't have a single cent to my name an hour ago. He knew exactly what was in that closet. Leo. His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. Your jacket. Where did you get the money? I looked down at the empty ceramic bowl in my hands. I thought about the old woman at the intersection. I thought about the homeless man under the plastic tarp. I looked back at Sam, and I offered him a small, tired smile. I found a 20 in my old jeans. I lied smoothly. Don't worry about it. Sam stared at me for a long time. He didn't push it. He just reached out, his hands still warm from the fever, and weakly squeezed my freezing wrist. Thank you, he whispered. I helped him lie back down on the mattress, pulling the blanket securely around his shoulders. I placed the leftover cash on the floor right next to his pillow, where he would see it when he woke up. I sat back against the wall and watched him. Within minutes, the medicine started to work. The violent shivering stopped. The deep furrows on his forehead smoothed out. His breathing slowed down, becoming deep, even, and incredibly peaceful. I sat there in my wet clothes, cold, broke, and missing the only valuable thing I owned. But as I listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing, blending seamlessly with the rain against the glass, a strange feeling washed over me. There was no anger left. There was no anxiety about tomorrow's rent or next week's meals. My chest felt completely light. I looked at my sleeping friend in the dim shadows. He had told me in the alleyway that his empathy was a curse. He told me that once you see someone else's pain, you can't unsee it. You can't just walk away and sleep soundly. I looked at my empty wrists. I looked at the empty bowl. And I realized he was absolutely right. But the thing about this curse is that it is highly contagious. The selfish, pragmatic guy who had spent years complaining about his best friend's foolish kindness had just caught it. I had traded my armor to keep him warm. I had bought my own peace of mind. I had been cursed. And as I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes, listening to the rain, I realized something else. I didn't mind it at all. Sam's fever broke just before dawn. The gray morning light began to creep through the dusty window panes, casting a soft, cool glow over the tiny apartment. I was still sitting against the wall, my wet clothes having dried into stiff, uncomfortable creases. I hadn't slept, but I didn't feel tired. I felt strangely quiet. Inside, Sam shifted on the mattress. He opened his eyes, blinking against the pale light. He looked around confused for a moment, before his gaze fell on the small stack of folded bills resting on the floor beside his pillow. He didn't ask about the jacket again. He didn't offer a grand speech of gratitude. He knew exactly what had happened, and he knew that words wouldn't change it. He just looked up at me, his eyes clear and free of the agonizing weight he had been carrying the day before. He gave me a small, genuine smile. Not the exhausted, broken smile from the alleyway, but a quiet, knowing one. "You're an idiot, Leo," he rasped, his voice still hoarse. I smiled back, leaning my head against the cold plaster wall. "Yeah," I said softly. "I know." He reached out and picked up the bills, folding them carefully into his pocket. We still had no jobs. We were still broke. The landlord would still come knocking at the end of the week. Nothing about our brutal reality had actually changed. We hadn't won the lottery. No wealthy benefactor was going to swoop in and rescue us from the grind. We were just two fools in a freezing apartment, armed with nothing but a few dollars and a dangerous amount of empathy. But as Sam closed his eyes again, pulling the blanket up to his chin. His breathing immediately fell back into a slow, deep rhythm. He wasn't tossing and turning. He wasn't grinding his teeth in his sleep, haunted by the faces of the people he couldn't save. He was at peace. And looking at him, I realized that this was the wealth he had been talking about all along. It wasn't a bank account. It wasn't a warm apartment or a full stomach. It was the ability to lay your head down in the dark, knowing that in a world so eager to be cruel, you chose to be kind. Even when it cost you everything, it is a foolish, reckless way to live, but it is the only way to earn a truly quiet mind. It has been 4 months since that night in the freezing apartment. To buy back my leather jacket from the pawn shop and keep the landlord from throwing our things onto the street, we had to pick up second jobs. From midnight until 6 in the morning, long after our day shifts ended, we became ghosts of the city. We worked as late-night food delivery riders. It is a brutal, bone-chilling way to make a living. We navigated the flooded, neon-lit alleys on beat-up motorbikes, our hands numb, our faces stung by the freezing monsoon rain, delivering warm meals to people safe and dry inside their homes. I was parked under a flickering street lamp outside a closed convenience store, waiting for my next order. Across the street, I watched Sam pull up to the curb. He had just finished a delivery. As he got off his bike to stretch his aching back, an elderly street sweeper pushed her heavy cart past him. She was wearing a thin, torn raincoat. She stopped under an awning to cough, taking off her cheap cotton gloves to wring the freezing, dirty water out of them. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding from the cold. Sam didn't hesitate. I watched my best friend reach into his storage box, pull out his only pair of thick, waterproof winter gloves, the ones he had saved up a week's tips to buy, and walk over to her. He gently handed them to the old woman, gave a small bow of his head, and walked back to his bike. He rode off into the rain, gripping the icy handlebars with his bare, freezing hands. A few months ago, I would have chased him down. I would have yelled at him until I was hoarse. I would have called him an idiot for sacrificing his own warmth. But tonight, I just sat there in the dark, watching his taillight disappear into the fog, and I smiled. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with my final delivery of the night. It was a cheap order, just 2 bowls of plain chicken noodle soup, going to a rundown motel on the edge of the city. I walked up the damp, dimly lit stairs and knocked on the peeling door of room 204. The door opened, revealing a young woman. She looked no older than 20, but the deep, bruised circles under her eyes made her look exhausted beyond her years. She was balancing a crying, feverish toddler on her hip, gently bouncing him while trying to keep him quiet so they wouldn't wake the neighbors. "I'm sorry it took so long to come to the door," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She shifted the baby and reached into her worn pocket, pulling out a thick stack of crumpled, faded low-denomination bills. It was exactly enough to cover the soup. Not a single note more. She started smoothing them out and counting them one by one, her hands shaking from exhaustion, apologizing under her breath for paying in such small change. I looked at the pathetic stack of worn paper money. I looked at the dark bags under her eyes, the crying baby, and the empty, cold motel room behind her. I felt a familiar, sharp ache in my chest. Before I even realized what I was doing, I reached out and gently pushed her hand back. "Don't worry about it," I said softly, handing her the warm plastic bags of food. "The app actually glitched tonight. This order was already paid for by a promotional credit. It's on the house." She looked at me, completely stunned, a desperate kind of hope flashing in her tired eyes. Are you sure?" "Positive," I lied smoothly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Have a good night. Hope the little guy feels better." I turned around and walked fast down the creaky stairs before she could process it and argue. When I got back to our apartment, Sam was already there. He was sitting on the floor, blowing on his red, freezing hands, trying to get the feeling back into his fingers. I sat down next to him, leaning against the cold wall. I reached into my pocket, took out the cash I had earned from 6 hours of riding in the freezing rain, and separated the cost of the woman's noodle soup. I had just paid for a stranger's meal with my entire night's profit. My pockets were empty again. I was soaking wet. I was exhausted, and my stomach was growling loudly. Sam looked at the few crumpled bills left in my hand, then looked up at my face. He didn't ask what happened. He saw the quiet, peaceful look in my eyes. He recognized it. He nudged my shoulder with his, a tired grin spreading across his face. "Told you," Sam whispered. "It's a curse." I looked at my empty hands, then closed my eyes, listening to the heavy rain drumming against the window. I had nothing to show for the night's labor, but for the first time in my life, as I leaned my head back against the wall, I realized I wasn't angry. I wasn't anxious. My chest felt incredibly light, filled with a warm, steady calm that no amount of money could ever buy. I had finally caught the curse. And it was beautiful. "Yeah," I murmured, a smile breaking through my exhaustion. "I think it's terminal."